I've made one video describing the oral mindset and the literate mindset and suggesting that there's a kind of a sonic boom that takes place when societies, cultures make the transition from one to the other. The assumption in all this, of course, is that not that people don't have free will and that there's not a common humanity that's shared by all of us, but that the sort of programming that our minds are given by our culture to process knowledge and to think thoughts and share thoughts, that kind of has an impact on the kind of thinking that we do, on the values that we have, the places where we put our priorities. The question obviously follows, is there any sort of intermediate period between the oral and the literate? And in fact, the answer could be made, as for instance the scholar Ruth Finnegan has been saying for a generation now, that you really don't have anything but transition. Everybody is both oral and literate. These texts that we looked at, as I emphasized in my previous video, the things that come to us from antiquity obviously have been written down in some form, or we wouldn't have them. They certainly didn't have tape recorders or cameras way back when, so there has to have been some sort of, even if it was a very complicated hieroglyphic system understood by few, nevertheless one can speculate about what effect that might have had on the general mindset, just having that little infection of literacy, and that's always present when we look back into the past. By the same token, if you look at us today, and I'm making this video in a part of the country where a lot of people will go to church on Sunday, for instance. We find in the 21st century that these people who may be stockbrokers or may do taxes or do something very literate and mathematical and complicated during the week will go to it, depending on the denomination, they may go to church twice on Sunday and once more on Wednesday night, and the experience that they have there will be a very oral kind of experience. There's a text, naturally, there's scripture, but the scripture most of the time is being read and the spoken word is being heard. Not only that, but there's a very audience indexed kind of response to the text. It depends on the denomination again, but some churches that I'm aware of get quite active when they are whipped up by a good preacher. And there's a lot of verbal responding that's going on, and the preacher, of course, feeds off of that and can shape it to his purposes. This is not the sort of reflective interaction with Scripture that other denominations, I'm trying not to put my foot too deep in it here, but I'm just saying that we, in 2013, which is when I'm making this, one finds in the United States of America, which is the most high-tech society on earth right now, one nevertheless does find relics of culture that appeared to be very tribal, very communal. And the churches that I'm talking about, I get the feeling sometimes that they don't consider you one of the faithful if you don't participate in the communal event of being at church with the other people at that right place and time. So it's a very communal focus. And so tip my hat to Ruth Finnegan. I think that we never are completely rid of the tribal state of our distant ancestors. It's part of us even in our more, and you know, I said this too in the earlier video, that the electronic age in some ways, and I personally am disturbed by these ways, but we are being carried back into certain aspects of tribalism. So perhaps in 2013 we're less far away from the tribal than we were, say, in 1960. I think that's very true. Anyway, on this subject of transition, yes, I think there is certainly, with respect to Ruth Finnegan, I think we can generalize about certain intermediate characteristics. I think we have to. I think there's a reality there, even if it's just a general reality. Generalizations, if you don't generalize, you don't think. There are always specific exceptions. Let me read you something from a medieval text from Wales called the Mabinogion, which is actually a collection of several manuscripts that are more or less close to oral tradition. This particular manuscript, it's called The Dream of Rhonabwy. It's probably less oral traditional than anything else in this little book, and in fact the author of the piece celebrates his distance from the verbal performance. I'm just selecting something here almost at random. Listen to this. And as they looked, they could hear a rider coming towards them upon a dappled gray horse. I don't know how you hear the horse's color from the sound, but anyway, and exceeding strange color was upon his horse, dappled gray, and his right leg bright red, and from the top of his legs to the middle of his hoof horn bright yellow. The rider and his horse arrayed in heavy foreign armor. The housing of his horse, from his front saddle bow upwards, pure red sendal, and from the saddle bow downwards, pure yellow sendal. A huge gold-hilted one-edged sword on the youth's thigh, and a new bright green scabbard to it, and a tip to the scabbard of laton of Spain. His sword belt of heavy black fleecy cordwain, and gilt crossbars upon it, and a clasp of ivory thereon, and a huge black tongue to the clasp, a gold helm upon the rider's head, and precious stones of great virtue therein, and on top of the helm the image of a yellow-red leopard with two bright red stones in its head. And I'm not going to keep, you kind of get the idea. If I haven't already lost you or put you to sleep, this thing goes on for about 12 or 15 pages. It has no story. It's Rhonabwy is having a dream of these Arthurian knights from the heroic age, and he's describing the dream in merciless detail. And in fact, this is what you can't call him a storyteller, but this is what the writer says at the end of the little piece. He's kind of pumping his fist and saying, and this story is called The Dream of Rhonabwy, and here is the reason why no one, neither bard nor storyteller, knows the dream without a book. By reason of the number of colors that were on the horses, and all that variety of rare colors both on the arms and their trappings, and on the precious mantles and the magic stones. So the writer has discovered through writing the ability to insert minute detail into his narrative, and he's so proud of that that he's dedicated this dozen-page manuscript that has no story to tell just to celebrate his descriptive ability. He's saying traditional tellers can't do this. I can. I've discovered how to write, and I've discovered that I can use my writing just to turn my back on their storytelling prowess and to show off all this miraculous description that I could do. If I had to remember all this stuff, what color the hooves were, and what colors you could hear by listening, anyway, not one of my favorite, but it's fascinating that a writer from this intermediate period would regard his past, his reverend oral traditional past, as growing obsolete. He's beginning to feel these new powers that writing has bestowed upon him, but he hasn't yet discovered the literate author's marvelous ability to use detail to indicate important elements of plot that will make the tension rise, or will expose details about the psychology of the central characters, or all of the things that, say, an Edgar Allan Poe would be able to do. This guy's in the middle. Now, should we therefore call this triumphant use of detail to a degree that really isn't very successful in creating a work of art. Should we say that this is characteristic of the intermediate period? That would be kind of like saying the intermediate period is has neither the virtues of the oral nor those of the literate. It's kind of sagging and waiting for something else to be born. And, you know, I think that's usually implied in the way we use the word middle. That when we talk about the whole Middle Ages, the insinuation is that, well, there's not really much happening that's important here. We finished with antiquity, and we're waiting for the Renaissance, and it's just around the corner. It's a few centuries down the road still, and if we can just last out the Middle Ages, we'll get to something better. I don't want to make the description of this intermediate period. That's why I don't like to call it intermediate or transitional or, God forbid, middle. I really want to emphasize other things about the mindset of these people, because a lot of people around the world, and one thinks immediately of the Chinese and the Indians, have lived in a kind of intermediate phase for a long, long time, very successfully. It appears quite viable to have a society with literate people on the top of the pyramid. There are not very many of them, and the vast majority, the big bulk of the pyramid down here is still pre-literate, but the tension between top and bottom is almost non-existent. There's a kind of collaboration that's been worked out between the various classes, and there's a great stability in this sort of society. I think in medieval Europe the same was also true. So let me read, and of course that's my field. China and India are really a little bit beyond my horizon. Let me read you something else from the Middle Ages. Let's see, what have I got here? Having mechanical difficulties. I'm going to try to pick up where I left off. The room where I am is not ideal, but at least I've got the same shirt on, and unless you're a medieval Welsh scribe, you probably can't smell it over the internet. This is a Welsh actually I translated this text myself from another tale in the Mabinogion. This is called a romance. It's the story of Owain, or the Countess of the Fountain. And I picked out the passage that would correlate the best to Rhonabwy in terms of description, because this one has more description than any other place in the narrative. The person talking is Keenan, who's the cousin of the central character Owain, and he's describing to Arthur's Round Table a miraculous adventure that he took. And early in the phase of the adventure, he crossed a stream, which itself is significant, as I'll explain in a moment. And he says, I'll try my Welsh accent on this one, okay? And they came up toward the citadel, and behold, two lads curly-headed, yellow-haired, and a garland of gold about the head of each of them, and a tunic of yellow silk brocade about each of them, and two buskins of new leather about the feet of each, and buckles of gold fastening these upon their ankles, and to each of them a bow of elephant tusk in hand, and bowstrings of deer sinew upon them, and arrows too, and their shafts of walrus tusk after being winged with peacock feathers, and heads of gold upon the shafts, and knives with golden blades upon them, and their handles of walrus tusk, in each of two targets, and they two lads a-casting the knives in contest. And a span away from them I saw a man curly-headed, yellow-haired, in his life's prime, and his beard newly clipped, and a tunic and mantle of yellow silk brocade about him, and a ribbon of gold weave in his mantle, and two buskins of mottled leather upon his feet, and two gold snaps fastening them. Well, that's just a lot of description, and not only that, but it's repetitive description, such as we would expect of an oral text. We have the buskins, which are knee-high boots, and we have the silk brocade and the yellow colors, and the men are curly-headed and blonde-haired. It's not detail that's unique and particular. It's not the sort of thing that we saw the Ronawi writer boasting about. But it's not just stale, irrelevant tradition either. I think that these elements in the story are tipping us off to the fact that Kenan is entering the other world. Let me briefly try to explain. A medieval audience in a place like Wales would have grown up, all of them, with a common stock of myth and lore behind them. Now, these are people who've been Christianized, but they haven't forgotten all of their ancestral lore, not by a long shot. They realize that when Kenan crosses that river, that he's, anytime that you find a mythic hero going across a body of water, there's a kind of change of state. That's a hint that some sort of alteration. This is sort of like a baptism or something. He's entering a new world. And these figures are also bright and marvelous, and they, unlike most Celtic people, they have blonde hair and blue eyes. It could be a memory of the arrival of the Scandinavians in Wales, but I think mythically it's a signal too that Kenan is going into this otherworldly space, and the people are elaborately polite to him. And they answer his question about where he can go to find some sort of adventure to prove his mettle. They direct him later on to the fountain, where if you get a bowl of water at this miraculous fountain and you pour it out on the marble slab, then a whole cycle of years' weather pans through in a minute or two. There's a terrible storm and hail, the leaves fall off the trees, and then birds settle on the limbs and they sing these beautiful songs, and obviously spring is back. And once the year cycle, as it were, has completed, the Black Knight, who's a symbol of death, appears. He doesn't kill Kenan, but he unhorses him and takes his horse in a jousting match. And Kenan goes back and reports the story to his cousin Owain and to other figures at the round table. And Owain decides this is such a terrific adventure that he has to go on it himself. And of course he completes successfully the duel with the Black Knight, and eventually ends up marrying the widow of the Black Knight. But what I'm trying to quickly suggest about this description is that it's not irrelevant to the story. In fact, it's critically plugged in to the story. The descriptions are signaling to the audience, do you remember those stories that your great-great-grandfathers used to tell and to listen to? Of course you do. You grew up with those too. And they were stories about going to the land of the spirits, the Tir na Nog, they call it in Irish. You cross the water and go to the island, and everybody's young and everything's beautiful. This is the sort of land that Owain is entering successively, because there are about 3 different passages into this space distantly removed, the ultimate of which is the castle of the Lady of the Fountain, whom Owain marries. Now, he defends her realm for a period of years until he remembers his comrades back at the round table. He goes back to be with them a while, and then he forgets about his wife and the kingdom that he's acquired. And he goes through a kind of a death, and he's reduced to a natural state where he wanders around like Bigfoot with no clothes on and no name and doesn't know what day of the week it is. And finally he's anointed with a kind of miraculous ointment and goes through a penitential period. Well, you see, this has been Christianized. All of this ancient mythic material about the journey to the strange world is being adapted to contemporary terms that broadcast the Christian message about death to the old man, the natural man, and rebirth into a form that accepts and recognizes higher obligation, the obligation that Owain took upon himself when he married the widow, the Lucia-like figure. I think of Dante's Lucia. That's sort of the Countess of the Fountain. She lights up his life, but he loses her beacon for a while, and he has to win it back. But once he has it back, he keeps it. And there's a lion in this that figures symbolically too, but the whole story is an attempt to take ancient myths and to reference them to meanings in this new Christian worldview. And we call this allegory, when you have a sequence of things that are of events and objects that are symbolically oriented to a storyline with a more cosmic kind of message. This is like a parable. This is what an allegory is. And this is very ingenious, and this is what writers and poets of the Middle Ages are very good at for some reason. They're not like the Ronabui writer. They're not just throwing out the baby with the bathwater and saying, I'm done with that. I can do something so much better than you guys ever dreamed of doing. And he forgets how to tell a story. Most of these authors would keep the story alive, but they would vivify it even more. And in fact, it's as if they're telling their audience, their culture, our ancestors had some of the truth. It's not that all of their myth and lore was false, but they didn't have the key to it. They didn't know how to turn it and open the door. And we, by allegorizing the story and giving it its spiritual significance, are showing you opening the door and letting the full light of day come in. We're showing you the whole truth of it. This is the more typical attitude of a medieval writer or philosopher toward pagan antiquity. These were, especially in the Celtic world, these were not people who just tossed all of this stuff out with contempt. You might have found that commonly on the continent in places, but especially these Irish and Welsh writers who were so influential in the Middle Ages. They were the ones who really gave us the stories of Arthur and the Round Table. They're looking at this bequest of pagan material as having a deeper meaning. And of course it really didn't. It was not, except in perhaps some subconscious way that's related to basic human nature, but the conscious intent of the pagan authors was clearly not to be broadcasting a Christian message. So the allegorists are having to use their imagination. And sometimes they can make these tie-ins more convincingly than at other times. And to me, this is the pleasure and the joy of this period, to see how these writers and thinkers can use the imagination to try to make something that's just appears to be just what it is on the surface, and transform that into a layered, a multi-dimensional transmission that rewards deeper thought. I think the interaction with a literate text of some sort must have encouraged this kind of thought, because most people still don't read and write, of course. Let's concede that. But they're becoming more familiar with the presence of a text. They are read to. They have, I'm sure all of these works that I'm referring to were read out loud to collections of people. So the presence of a document with writing on it was not a mystery to these people. And the idea of having something that you can ponder, you don't have to catch the words in your ear the instant they're pronounced and hold them in your memory while you're listening to more words that are coming to you. There's a new leisure that's involved in this text delivery. You can actually ask the performer to, can you read that again? Or can you stop a moment? Got to run to another room because my camera's dying, or whatever, a bathroom break or something. They could tell the performer to hold up a minute or to go back and reread. There's a sort of leisure that allows the interstices between the words, the little cracks between the lines, to be explored more deeply. Again, this is true even if you yourself don't actually read. And this invites, it seems to me, a sort of allegorization or addition of deeper possible meanings to the words and ideas that you're listening to. Another word that I use besides allegory to describe this period, since I'm trying to get away from intermediate and middle and all of that stuff, I use the word dialogic, which of course is from the word dialogue. I'm not as confident in that word as I am allegory, but dialogue, of course, is a kind of logic. How is it different from logic? Here's what I'm trying to explore and explain to myself, really, because these are new ideas, and I'm just feeling them out. In fact, I'm sort of this is what the dialogic means to me. This is why I think it's descriptive of this period. These people are feeling out new ideas. They don't yet have a logical system. We don't have an Immanuel Kant or René Descartes, a giant of reason, of mathematical, geometrical rigidity and rigor. A true literate logician could teach to his students, to his audience, the rules by which the mind operates objectively, and then the students would carry those forth into their endeavors, and they would be the pygmies sitting on the shoulder of the giant. They would carry the exploration further, but they wouldn't have to get together and talk a lot to figure out what the rules are, because they've already been figured out. The literate world has discovered scientific method. It's discovered the basic logical rules that compose consistent thoughts. We're not there yet. We're not certainly not at the oral phase, where people do a lot of talking, but they're not really feeling their way through to try to get at a deeper truth. They're talking a lot in proverbs and in things that I discussed in the earlier video. They're asking themselves, what would Granddaddy have done? They're trying to reference their problem or their exploration to the wisdom of the past. So they're not really looking for new meaning. They're just trying to see how the old meanings apply to new situations. Here we have the middle, where you can imagine something like a Socratic situation with the teacher and his students just hashing things out, not really knowing. I don't think Socrates knows where most of his dialogues are going to end up. I think he's having a hell of a good time just kind of feeling his way through with his students. He bounces questions off of them, and whatever they answer, he says, okay, well, if that's so, then you think this would be true too? And they're just kind of meandering around, working their way toward a deeper understanding. That, it seems to me, is very much the sort of intellectual activity that's going on in this allegorization. So I'm going to say of the middle period that it's allegorical dialogic. It's people have not thrown out the old ways. They haven't turned their back on the old stories, the old ways, but the way that they can keep them alive in this period where they want deeper answers is to read more meaning into them. And talk is a large part of this attempt to find something deeper, but it's a text-based talk. It's oriented to, now here's our starting point. This is what's written down. How can we get past this to find the hidden message? I think that another thing that fascinates me, you can see this just in the style of the period. I've got another romance. I'm going to say a few words about romance after I finish this, because that's a fascinating characteristic of this transitional period, this allegorical period as well. This is a late medieval romance called The Adventure of Melora and Orlando. It's written in Irish, and it's written in an oral style that's more oral than a Catharwid or a Philly could have made it. It's the techniques of live performance, the alliteration, the use of synonyms that are clumped together to create a kind of rhythmic effect. This writer has sat down with quill and paper. We don't know who this person is any more than we know who the writers of the Welsh pieces are, so this may even have been a woman. But this person has used his or her piece of paper to introduce oral sound effects and maximize them. A poet who's just doing this stuff off the top of his head would not have been able to achieve such effects. Let me try, without mauling the Irish too much, I'm going to try to read a little bit of this and see if I can emphasize some of the sound effects. This is Orlando going into the Forest of Wonders to try to find a wonder that he can carry back to the round table and report to everybody, because the story goes that King Arthur can't sit down to supper until he's heard of a wonder on that day. I guess he starves if nothing much is happening that week. But it's Orlando's turn to go out and look for something strange, and where better to go for strange things than the Forest of Wonders? So let's see, first he sees a couple of hands fighting a sword duel without any body attached to them, and he thinks, well, that's pretty weird, but I'm going to keep looking and see if there's something else. And here's the one where he looks up into the trees and he sees a pure crystal ship sailing up in the treetops. Irshin gavas a cheshtel na forisha shalaila, agus ni hata dochi an tan at chornach long luchtvar lanefshach gon kera sholtieg sala orha, agus gan cloch gan no kran no achmad Eila incha ach gloria tanna tíð technevach, agus íag sholach tar barif kran, agus fívoria nísagera no gach long mór, agus gan durin incha ach mag elta a jespi glé gela do vi a kinshan kjol agus orfia hestjo uchtarach na lungashin. Yeah, that's a single sentence, and it's a big mouthful. And I think if I could actually pronounce Irish, and if I were reading that, I could get through it with a lot of grand effect. But I think if I were a Philly or just a traditional performer, I would have a hard time just doing that sentence off the top of my head. Fortunately, I've translated it, and I've tried to replicate some of the effects in English. Here we go. He sees the hands that are fighting the sword. He says, the king of the world may take his meal and his refreshment upon that wonder there. Though it were so, I will not leave the forest until I see another wonder, for fear that the king may not be satisfied with this one. After that, he took to travelling the forest for another while. And not long did he go till he saw an imposing enormous ship with 4 extraordinary sails upon her, and neither post nor masts nor other work of wood in her, but all of them clear shimmering crystal, and she a sailing over the tops of the trees and copses more swiftly than any ship upon the sea, and without any crew in her, but it were the flocks of snow-white swans, a-singing songs and harmonies upon the very top of that ship. And the whole thing it's not just one passage as it is with that description intense passage in Owain, but really this whole thing is written in that style. I call it hypertrophy. It's sort of stylistic hypertrophy, where the allegorists are so aware of the style of the past and so admiring of it that they actually turn it up a notch. They double down on it through the use of their writing. They don't have that contempt that we detected in the writer of The Dream of Ranabwi, where they're trying to do something entirely different from what and just mocking the past for its inability to go where they've gone. They're following in the footsteps of the past, but they're deeper footsteps. They're using their literacy to introduce a kind of profundity that wasn't there before. So I think you see in style the same objective, the same ambition that you see in the effort to get at a deeper content in these tales. I'm a great admirer, really. The more that I study these works of the Middle Ages, the more I said something similar about the tribal period, and when I called it the kind of the childhood of humanity. But this is not childish. I think this is a fully adult place to be. I think that we literates have lost something, honestly, in our insistence that things are what they have an objective reality, and everything that's loaded upon them, all the symbolism and the spirituality and the poetic resonance and all that stuff, it's cute, it's fun, but it's not going to butter your bread. It doesn't, we're not going to put a man on the moon just writing poetry. It doesn't really, it's kind of a waste of time. That's an impoverished way for a human being to think, although it's a very literate, scientific sort of outlook. And this allegorical dialogic period is very plugged in to the spiritual resonance. It is more subjective, of course, but it's more enriching in human terms. The invitation to look at events and objects in life, and not just to kind of thump them for their mass and volume and their scientific meaning, but to give them some kind of moral significance. These people were so tuned into that, and we've practically lost it entirely. They were aware that their lives, like Sir Gawain's journey to find the Green Chapel, that their lives were journeys. They knew that they were not Sir Gawain. They knew that they weren't heroes, and yet, in a sense, in an allegorical sense, they were, or they were being given a chance to be by their belief system. Their God expected them to rise to the occasion and to oppose the dragons and the sorcerers that are represented by the moral challenges of daily life. Now, they bought into that, and I think that it made their lives much more meaningful. Where has that gone with us? I'm going to say this about, as I get back to romance, because both of these last two things that I've read are romances, not just in the literary sense that they wander around and have exotic settings and there's a lot of miraculous things that happen. That's the broader definition of a romance, but we think of romance as man and woman love as well. And in fact, in both of these stories, I talked about Owain and the Countess of the Fountain. Orlando, too, he's eventually lured into a cave in this forest of wonders where Merlin enchants him, and he's as good as dead. He can never get out of the cave unless his fiancée, Melora, journeys all about the world and finds three enchantments, three marvelous things that will break the spell. She has to dress up as a knight and go out and do the things that a man does in order to accomplish that mission. But she does. So both of these stories are about not just love between a man and a woman, but a committed, struggling, arduous love. And it strikes me that, I've only been thinking about this since I was preparing for this retake. I didn't even mention this in the earlier versions, but I'm about to be very politically incorrect, too, so maybe it would be better if I didn't say this. But it strikes me that romance needs allegory. If the man thinks of his woman as a kind of a princess in a tower, it inspires him to be a better man, to think less of himself, to undertake more dangerous things, to be braver, to keep his promises better. A wine breaks a promise, but he's forgiven and he does his penance and he becomes a better man because of that. It's because he has that beautiful lady in the tower that he is able to lift himself up. Women, too, look for their brave, masculine, fearless knight, and none of us men is really that, but we wish we were. And if the women in our lives wanted us to be more that way, we would become more that way. We have trouble finding the motivation within us to be better, to outdo ourselves, to overachieve. But if we have someone else that expects that of us, we love that. That's part of what we love about that person. And that's part of what created romance in Western culture. Not just literarily, but even socially. Now, I'm just this week reading all about hookups and all about campus affairs of convenience that give people what they want for the moment. But, of course, women don't like being thought of now as princesses in towers. They don't like being put on pedestals. They want to be seen as just what they are. Anything else is an insult. Men, men, I don't think men resent being thought of as knights in shining armor. It makes it a little easier for them to accomplish their mission, but their mission certainly isn't to pledge a promise to somebody and become a better human being. We've really, do you see what I mean when I suggest that we've lost something important in becoming so scientifically oriented to the objective value of the object, that this has impoverished us as spiritually as human beings. People who think of life more allegorically have not lost that vital human element. In fact, they've greatly enhanced it. So I don't know what the life expectancy for the typical person in the Middle Ages was. I'm sure it stopped at about 40. In many ways, life was not real great at these times. But it's not as bad as you'd think. And in psychological, emotional, spiritual terms, I suspect that we're a long way today from having room to look down upon these people and sneer at them. So, just as I did with the earlier video, I think that's where I'll finish off this one. Just think about what it means to be part of this dialogic, allegorical kind of culture, and learn some respect for it. And I'd perhaps even embrace some of these ways of thought and try to import them into your own life, because we can learn something from those people.